So today, we'll take a look at what's coming to the Magic Kingdom over the next 6 or maybe even 7 years. Yesterday, we looked at development plans for the Animal Kingdom, and today we'll continue to explore these announcements with some nuance in an attempt to define what these announcements truly mean for the resort. So no big lead-in here. If you're ready, let's just jump in. We'll start with the smallest piece of news for the Magic Kingdom, then move to the biggest piece, before exploring the most controversial news from this last week. So, to start with, we now have a general opening date for the Pirates-themed lounge at the Magic Kingdom, and it's very clear now that this will be something akin to a bar like Oga's Cantina inside the Magic Kingdom, which is a big change for that park. From the official parks blog, this is the quote. Here, bandits and buccaneers-to-be from every corner of the seven seas are welcome to join together and raise a toast to the pirate life. In the newly released artwork, X marks the spot for a seaworthy selection of grog and grub inside this tavern location coming to Magic Kingdom Park. We still don't have a confirmed location for this lounge, but the two likely places are the old Tortuga Tavern or the defunct Pirates League. This new piece of artwork doesn't really suggest one over the other. If I were Disney, I'd put this lounge in the larger of the two spaces, which would be Tortuga Tavern, but I'm not sure that Disney is going down this path. Regardless, the opening date will be 2025, and based on very little being completed so far, I would guess late 2025, perhaps rolled out and tested during Mickey's Very Scary next year, but more likely a week or so before Thanksgiving. Again, that's just a guess. As we talked about in our last episode, the D23 presentation last Saturday had many missteps. But the one announcement that got a truly enthusiastic response from the crowd, a bursting forth of applause, was this. Disney will build a Villain's Land in the Magic Kingdom. This is a project that has been rumored in various forms for roughly 20 years at the Magic Kingdom or over at Hollywood Studios or perhaps even as a standalone park. But this now seems to be what the company settled on, a land at the back of the Magic Kingdom, and I should point out that as it's at the back of the park, it has room to potentially expand, much like Fantasyland did a decade ago. The official quote later posted to the Disney Parks blog as to what would be there is this. This space will be home to two major attractions, dining and shopping, on an incredibly twisted grand scale. There was only one piece of concept art for this, a piece of art that showed you what the land would look like as you were about to walk into it, perhaps from behind the Haunted Mansion or maybe from Fantasyland. On the left side was clearly Maleficent's castle, high atop the Forbidden Mountain, along with a full-scale version of Maleficent in dragon form. All of this is very much on model with the 1959 animated film Sleeping Beauty. And if you look a little to the left of that dilapidated tower castle, there is clearly roller coaster track fixed into the rockwork, with the track itself apparently made out of thorny vines, much like those that Maleficent created at the end of Sleeping Beauty. There also appears to be loops in that coaster track, but again, this is all vague concept art. It might be a little safer here for Disney to have a more family-friendly coaster in the Magic Kingdom, more like Big Thunder or perhaps on the upper end, even like Everest. That is, a fast coaster without loops. On the right-hand side of this land, there are mountains and a fair bit of water, arranged in what might be a track course. I would assume that the other major ride here is a dark ride featuring multiple villains. The water, I'm guessing, perhaps suggests that this dark ride would use a boat. This might be an opportunity to use a modified boat experience, like the one in Pirates at Shanghai, but that is purely speculation on my part. But it does seem that Disney is reusing that boat system for the Avatar experience at Disneyland, so at least to me it makes sense that they would maybe try to use that system somewhere in Florida as well. Regardless of the ride specifics here, this land will solve two demographic problems in the Magic Kingdom. Fantasyland is largely a celebration of princesses, which tends to appeal more, though of course not exclusively, to young girls. Villains Land will have attractions that should appeal to both boys and girls and also to older teenagers, making the Magic Kingdom better balanced in terms of park interest areas. If you're a family with teenagers and young children, the Magic Kingdom should play a little better now. The Villains area will also add much-needed capacity to Florida's most crowded park, and it should add at least one table service restaurant, which are in short supply here. Villains Land almost surely will be in the space behind the Haunted Mansion, which is exactly where we've speculated it would be placed for at least a year now. We can assume this based on elements I'll talk about in the next announcement in just a few minutes. But here's an interesting question. If Villains Land is behind the mansion, does that then mean the mansion becomes grouped with Villains Land, or does the mansion stay with Liberty Square? And again, we'll talk about this more in just a moment, but it seems clear that the Liberty Square riverboat is going away for another set of attractions. Again, once more, give me just a couple minutes to get to that. And if the mansion does in fact join Villains Land, which at this point is only speculation, does that then suggest Disney is considering removing or retheming all of Liberty Square? Does Liberty Square then become a very small land with just the Hall of Presidents? And just to point out the obvious, with a politically divided and politically charged country, the Hall of Presidents has increasingly become a problem for Disney. One solution for the Hall of Presidents might simply be to have George Washington and Old Abe speak, which politically could be a good middle ground. But if the Hall of Presidents does go away, does Liberty Square take on some new theme, or could Liberty Square become the opening street that leads into the Villains area? Kind of like a creepy 18th century town that leads into the world of old and dark fairy tales. Maybe a colonial street with a touch of the Headless Horseman, perhaps? Or if Liberty Square goes away, does its space become converted into another part of Frontierland? And that larger Frontierland question leads us into the next announcement, which was a doozy. The other area announced would be a large addition to Frontierland, one arranged around the world of Pixar's Cars. This is not a clone of Cars Land at DCA, but rather an adaptation of the Cars IP into a rugged outdoor setting, terrain that resembles perhaps the Rockies. There would be an outdoor race course, similar at least in size to Radiator Springs Racers, and also a second, much smaller family attraction here. The official Disney Parks blog would later describe the two attractions this way. One attraction will invite you on a thrilling rally race through the mountains, take on wild terrain as you race across the landscape, climbing mountain trails, dodging geysers, and Mater's favorite, splashing through mud holes. But what about smaller racers? The second attraction will be geared toward them and will be fun for the whole family. As we talked about yesterday, the Tropical Americas area over at Animal Kingdom, which opens in 2027, has multiple presentation and planning models. The entire area is deeply planned and mapped out. The Villains area had only one very loose piece of art released to the public, mainly to define its mood, but with very few specifics. The Cars project in terms of the released art is somewhere in the middle. There were no models of the Cars area, but there were a number of pieces of art, all with far greater specificity than the art for Villains Land. Here for the Cars area, you can see the level of place planning in the images that were released. Ride scenes have specific locations based on the unified placement of the Big Thunder artwork in the background. This suggests that the main ride here in some form has been mapped out, though that map hasn't been released, perhaps because it's still under discussion. That is, there's clearly a plot plan here, but maybe there's some flexibility in that plan as things get nailed down. One of the interesting elements to note is that, at least in the very cartoony concept art, this ride doesn't appear to use vehicles on a slotted track such as at Radiator Springs or at Test Track. Those cars run best on very smooth surfaces. Even in the outdoor sections of Radiator Springs Racers, the cars are on an incredibly smooth metal road, a road that regularly gets resurfaced to help with maintenance and the ride experience. Maybe it's just an artist's flourish here, and maybe this will all end up being a very smooth, dirt-colored road, but at least right now the ride system here looks to be a significant upgrade to the Test Track cars, or perhaps some other ride system entirely. Though this wasn't part of the Saturday presentation, I'll put this information here. In artwork later released, if you zoom in really tight, you can see that the second small family attraction is closer to Big Thunder, an area that appears to have a lot of those Guido vehicles from the Cars movie, that is, the Italian forklift, and maybe some Luigi cars as well. It was impossible to tell if there was any firm concept for this kiddie ride in that artwork, or maybe the inclusion of those cars here was just a placeholder for where a family attraction would eventually go, to be better defined later. For the record, Cars Land in California has 2 small family rides, in addition to Radiator Springs Racers. I would expect something similar in terms of size and scope to one of those California rides in this place here. But back to the presentation as Josh DeMauro delivered it last Saturday. As DeMauro described the area, it was clear that there were at least 2 ways that this development would change the Frontierland section of the Magic Kingdom. First, even though the 2 Cars attractions would be part of Frontierland, the development of them definitely had the feel of a single IP mini-land like what Disney has built over at Hollywood Studios for the Toy Story films and for the Star Wars properties. That is, the presence of cars could easily overwhelm the presence of a traditional Frontierland. And second, placing modern talking cars into Frontierland meant that Disney was pivoting away from the current identity of that area, a place that for decades has been set in the 19th century American frontier. Frontierland, at least right now, is a place far from trucks and race cars. The area, I think, moving forward will be more themed around the American wilderness, likely the wilderness as it exists today. And I realize, in terms of media, 2024 is a very long ways from the 1950s or even the 1970s, when Westerns regularly showed up at the movies and on TV, when someone like Davy Crockett was an easily recognizable cultural icon, or even a little later, when computer games like the Oregon Trail were popular at school. Popular interests change, and this is Disney's attempt to change along with them. Perhaps more to the point, Disney doesn't now really produce any Western films or TV shows that look like they could be tied to the current version of Frontierland. Here's how Josh DeMauro put it. The American West has always been about keeping your eyes on the horizon, believing in yourself, carving your own path, and striving towards success. That goes for miners in the mountains, bears from the country, and a princess from the bayou, or a race car from the big city. I would say here that with that definition, this is now more a reboot of the concept beneath Frontierland, and generally I'm okay with that. But the revised layout of the area still concerns me. Remember how in our last episode I mentioned how at D23, presenters rarely tell the audience what is being lost to create something new, clearly a few people in the audience now started to key in on that particular problem. The applause for the Cars area in Frontierland was only lukewarm. There were a couple of moments in the evening where the applause was deeply enthusiastic, such as for the Villains area. And if you're an exec at Disney, I'm guessing that a lack of enthusiastic applause tells you that you might want to review your plans before spending $1 billion or so on them. At least near where I was sitting, there were even a few boos. It wasn't a lot, but there were some and they were noticeable. That was the only time all night I heard a boo. And remember in our last episode, I mentioned that during the D23 Parks presentation, some in the audience were already a little irritated with the endless 1980s and 1990s cover performances. This may have contributed to a situation where some audience members were already feeling a little less than gracious as this announcement was made. The negative reaction may have also been related to the changing time placement and identity of Frontierland, or the possibility that significant parts of Frontierland would go away to make room for this expansion. I'm sort of guessing that Disney is taking this and some very mixed online fan reactions into account. One of the big questions at this point, that is on Saturday night, as and just after this was being announced, was where exactly was Disney planning to build this if it would be part of Frontierland? Only on Monday, after the event was over and everyone went home, did Disney post the bird's eye artwork that showed exactly where this Cars area would go. That is, it saved the negative part until after the event was over. The Cars area will occupy the land now held by the river and Tom Sawyer Island. The plan clearly is to remove the entire river and the entire island and replace most of that with a Cars area. To be honest, as I've explained in previous episodes, I was expecting a shortened river and a partial removal of Tom Sawyer Island, maybe even to the point where the island was no longer an attraction. That is, I was expecting a reduction to this area, similar to what happened at Disneyland when Galaxy's Edge was built. Personally, I'm not so concerned about Tom Sawyer Island going away. The island, though lovely, is a large piece of land that very few people visit. Disney, I'm absolutely sure, knows exactly how many people visit that island on an average day. I love the island, but I also understand the underlying economics here. I'm more concerned that without the river, the Magic Kingdom will lose some of its identity as a Disney park. I have a short list of reasons as to why I think this. First, all of the Disney parks, both in the U.S. and overseas, have large public water areas. In Florida alone, there's Rivers of America, World Showcase Lagoon, Echo Lake, and Discovery River Lagoon. These are important landscape features that distinguish a Disney development from another variety of amusement park. A development that clearly says the presentation of a leisurely area inside of a park matters here. The removal of Rivers of America in Florida follows the removal of other large water features that were once in the Magic Kingdom, specifically the submarine lagoon and the castle moat and canals that long ago were used by the swan boats. The river, though, was the largest public-facing water feature anywhere in the Magic Kingdom. Second, there's really only a few images, I think, that immediately define a photo as having been taken inside of a Disney castle park, images that even date back to the time of Walt. The image of the Main Street train station, the image of a fairy tale castle, and the image of a paddle wheel steamship on a reasonably narrow river. With the removal of the river, the Magic Kingdom now loses one of these iconic locations. And third, even with additional trees that are featured in the artwork, This means that the Magic Kingdom will be a stretch of concrete from Space Mountain to Big Thunder, without a lot of open space or water areas to make a place that at least seems cooler and perhaps less crowded than other parts of the park. And in these three areas, I think there's something important that's being lost now. Yet I also understand the need to have large, exciting projects being built in the Magic Kingdom, projects that speak to younger guests who are far more familiar with Stickers and Mater than with Huck and Tom, and also create attendance drivers for the resort. It's probably also worth pointing out that with these new announcements, Disney is losing 2 play areas for younger kids, likely in the same year. Tom Sawyer Island and the Boneyard over at Animal Kingdom. But at least in the artwork, it looks like the resort is getting 1 new play area over at Hollywood Studios, which we'll talk about in a future episode. But as the art still feels somewhat loose for the Cars area, I'm guessing there may be an opportunity to include more of a water feature in this area than what the current artwork shows. That, I think, would be my one large suggestion here. And let me pause for a moment. For those out on the West Coast, I don't think you have much to worry about in terms of losing the Disneyland version of Rivers of America. That river has already been shortened. It has 2 boats, not just 1. Generally, I see more people on Disneyland's island than on the one at the Magic Kingdom. And the caves and experiences in California's island have already been upgraded to Pirate's Lair. They might need a little maintenance, but the upgrades are already there. The island in California also functions as the stage for Fantasmic, which remains extremely popular. And lastly, people on the West Coast get far more vocal when a Walt-era attraction is retired than people do on the East Coast when something from the 1970s goes away. One of Walt's key ideas for his park was the multi-century presentation of various transportation forms moving together to create a kinetic diorama with streetcars, boats, subs, early automobiles, and monorails all performing their beautiful mechanical dance together. And the river contributes to that image. But to get back to an earlier question, in the Bird's Eye released after the D23 event, it's still unclear what, if anything, will happen to Liberty Square. Bird's eyes are mostly conceptual. They're not an actual map, but the integration of Liberty Street is muddy in this image at best. You can easily see the facades of the current Frontierland, but the facades just down the way of Liberty Square are hidden by shadows and trees, which maybe tells you something important here. But to close all of this up, aside from the Pirates Tavern, none of these projects have opening dates. Josh D'Amaro said that work is beginning soon on all of these projects. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure that the first step in all of these projects is to develop alternate water reclamation routes around the Magic Kingdom for storm and water flow before anything can be done with the river. I would expect a lot of water-related permits to pop up first. Over at Animal Kingdom, as we discussed in our last episode, the Tropical America's Pueblo Esperanza area has an opening date of 2027. Again, I would guess late 2027, and I wouldn't be surprised if that gets bumped by a year. So in terms of the overall resort, there's an announced construction timeline up through 2027. Based on the art presently released, it seems clear that the Cars area is further along in the development and planning stages than the Villains area. I think we're looking at some time after 2027 for the Cars area. I'm going with 2029. In California, Cars Land was announced in 2007 and opened 5 years later in 2012. We're at the announcement point for the Florida project, and in California there was no river to fill in, no large water reclamation plan to arrange. For another comparison, after Galaxy's Edge was designed, it took about 3.5 years to construct at Disney World. And again, over on the Galaxy's Edge site, there were only some buildings to demo, no large river area to fill. So again, 2029 seems about right for the Cars area. And then sometime after that for the Villains Land. Villains Land, I think, would be the easier of the two to build, but I'm guessing some entrance paths and some development areas at the Villains Land would require the river to already be filled in. Reporters were told that all announcements were planned to be completed within 5 years. But in Disney speak, I think that could easily mean 6. 5 years from now is almost 2030. I would guess that we're looking at 2029 and 2030, or maybe even 2031, as opening dates for these two projects, with Cars going first and Villains second. Again, only a guess. But these are two of the largest expansion areas for the Florida resort moving forward. Later this week, we'll look at other large expansion areas announced for Disney World, and then next week we'll start in on other areas of the company, including Disneyland. I'll be back later this week with another episode exploring what was announced for the American parks and what it means for the future of the Disney company. Again, I'm trying to do two things with these episodes. I don't simply want to list off what was announced. I want to take us down a far more nuanced path, but also I want to get these discussions out there as quickly as I can. So I'm simply going to post up podcast episodes and videos as quickly as I can this week and next. Along those same lines, I have a short video of artwork for the Cars and Villains areas that I'll post up to our YouTube channel tomorrow. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link to Bandcamp down in our show notes. So, until later this week, this is Todd James Pierce.